In the second year of the Sydney settlement, Governor Arthur Phillip carried the colony's survival on his shoulders. Rations were thin, discipline was harsh, and every decision risked sparking wider violence along the coves and rivers. He tried to keep contact from turning into open war, leaning on figures like Bennelong as a bridge. Yet the shoreline was already a contested boundary where strangers arrived armed and hungry, and country answered with watchfulness and law. On the 7th of September 1790, that tension tightened at Manly Cove. What began as a shoreline meeting, people gathering, gestures exchanged, curiosity mixed with fear, shifted in seconds into danger. Phillip was present not as a distant administrator, but as the visible face of British power, stepping into a space where memories of earlier coercion still lingered, and where Aboriginal men could read the risks of closeness better than any European officer could. The spear strike that followed is remembered because it cut through the colony's illusion of control. In many retellings, the man who threw the spear is recorded under a name written in several spellings, often rendered as Willemering or Willemerin, because the archive struggled to hold Aboriginal language precisely. Whatever the exact spelling, the act itself was unmistakable, a deliberate wound delivered to the colony's decision-maker in front of witnesses on the sand. The moment of impact mattered as much as the injury. A spear in the governor's body was not merely pain, it was a message that authority could bleed. For a settlement that depended on the idea that British order would steadily expand, this was a shock to morale. If the governor could be struck in daylight during contact, then no patrol, no ration line, no farm road was truly safe. Fear does not wait for proof. It multiplies from one violent image. What followed was a short-armed scramble, muskets raised, men shouting, confusion about who to shoot and who to spare. This is where the frontier becomes intimate, weapons at close range, bodies clustered, and a single wrong trigger, turning a wound into a massacre. Phillip's earlier rules of the game were tested in real time. In such seconds, restraint is not a principle on paper. It is a hand held back while blood is visible. Bennelong's presence in the story matters because he represents the colony's dependence on mediation, even while it expanded by force. He could move between worlds, yet he could not erase what settlers were doing to country, nor could he guarantee safety when anger and grief were near the surface. Manly Cove shows the limits of mediation. It can slow violence, shape meanings, and prevent some deaths, but it cannot undo dispossession, fear, and accumulated insult. The British record often frames the spearing as a sudden betrayal or an incomprehensible act, but documentary history has to treat it as part of a longer chain. By 1790, the shoreline had already seen gunfire used to force landings, theft by desperate colonists, and pressure on fishing grounds and movement. In that context, a spear is not mystery. It is a reply made with the tools and law available to defenders. For Phillip, the wound created a political problem as well as a physical one. If the colony answered with indiscriminate shooting, it could ignite a broader war that Sydney was too fragile to sustain. If it answered with weakness, settlers might lose confidence and take vengeance into their own hands. A governor's authority on the frontier is always squeezed between hunger below and fear at the edges. Manly Cove forced that squeeze into the open. The episode also exposes how uneven the archive is. Phillip's name, intentions, and movements are recorded in detail, while Aboriginal participants appear as partial silhouettes, sometimes named, often misspelled, frequently reduced to a single action. That imbalance shapes public memory. It is easier to tell a story about a wounded governor than about the web of law, kin, and country that made the shoreline a boundary worth defending. A documentary must name that bias clearly. This first part sets the scene for the deeper question that follows. What did the spearing change, and what did it reveal? It revealed that early Sydney was not peacefully settling a coast. It was colliding with people who refused to surrender space or authority. In the next part, we will trace the lead-up more closely. How earlier contact patterns, coercion, and mediation built the powder-dry conditions that made one spear at Manly Cove echo across the colony. In the days leading to the 7th of September, 1790, Sydney lived in a dangerous calm. The colony needed contact to survive, guides, language, trade, and reduced hostility, yet it also kept expanding its reach for water, fish, and security. That contradiction meant every meeting on the shoreline carried two shadows, hunger and fear. Governor Arthur Phillip understood this better than most, because he could feel how quickly a single skirmish could turn settlers into a mob and push Aboriginal families into wider resistance. The governor's strategy depended on visibility. He did not want his authority to exist only behind palisades at Sydney Cove. He wanted to show that the British could walk, speak, exchange, and be present without immediate killing. In practice, that meant taking risks. It meant appearing on beaches and coves where he was not protected by walls. The colony called this leadership. Aboriginal people could read it as intrusion wrapped in confidence. Mediation was the other pillar. Bennelong had become a crucial figure of contact, someone who could interpret gestures and intentions across a widening gap. But mediation in early Sydney was never equal. Bennelong could speak, negotiate and warn, yet he could not command British hunger to stop, and he could not command British patrols to vanish from country. When mediation fails, it often fails suddenly because it collapses under the weight of everything it cannot fix. Manly Cove was not a random location. The coves north of Port Jackson were places of gathering and movement, watched closely by local people. They were also places the British visited for fishing, exploration, and contact. In this landscape, a governor arriving with officers and armed men could be read in multiple ways at once, as a meeting, as a test, or as a threat. A shoreline is where meanings collide fastest, because it is where strangers step out of boats and into someone else's law. The immediate lead-up was shaped by memory. Only months and years earlier, British landings had been forced in places like Kamai, and convicts had raided for food. The colony often tried to separate itself into disciplined authority and criminal convicts, but Aboriginal communities had no reason to trust that distinction. A man in British clothing was still part of the same pressure that cut into fishing grounds and made strangers dangerous. Philip's personal calculus was political. If he could keep contact open and reduce attacks, farms and supply routes might survive. If he failed, the colony could face a spiral of raids and reprisals it could not afford. But the more the colony expanded, the more it created the very conditions that made violence likely. In documentary terms, this is the tragedy. The governor tries to prevent war while building the frontier that makes war inevitable. On the beach, the surface ritual of contact could look almost calm. People standing at a distance, words not shared, gestures made with hands, items displayed as gifts or signs. Under that ritual, every body posture mattered. Who steps forward, who holds ground, who shows a weapon, who turns their back. In such meetings, a single movement can be read as either disrespect or attack, and once that interpretation locks in, it is almost impossible to reverse. The man often recorded as Villemering or Villimarin enters this story through that tense space. The fact that his name is preserved in uncertain spelling is itself revealing. The archive struggled to hold Aboriginal identity accurately, yet it remembered enough to mark a specific actor. This was not an anonymous native in the record. This was an individual whose action carried meaning and whose choice would cut into the colony's center of power with one throw. When the spear was raised, the moment was already loaded. The colony's leader stood in open ground. Armed men stood near him. Bennelong's presence signaled mediation, but mediation can also be read as a performance, an attempt to manage a situation without surrendering power. The spear strike, in this sense, is not only violence, it is refusal of performance. It is an act that forces the meeting to stop pretending it is safe. In the next part, we will slow the scene down to the second-by-second clash, where Phillip stood, how the crowd reacted, what the immediate armed response looked like, and why the choice not to escalate into a mass shooting mattered. We will also track how this moment was later remembered as treachery, as justice, or as a boundary enforced, depending on whose story was being told and what that story needed to justify. On the 7th of September, 1790, the shoreline at Manly Cove became a tight stage where every step carried danger. People gathered in proximity close enough to see faces and weapons. The governor's party arrived with the habits of naval order, officers near the center, muskets present even if not aimed, eyes scanning for sudden movement. Across from them stood Aboriginal men, who understood the beach as a boundary that must be enforced, not as a neutral meeting ground. The spear throw is remembered because it was decisive and because it was public. In many accounts, the man who struck Phillip is identified in spelling variants, often Villemering or Villemarin, while other participants remain unnamed. The archive captures the action more clearly than the surrounding human context, yet the meaning is plain. The colony's highest authority was wounded in open view, showing that the frontier was not a distant perimeter, but a blade pressed to the settlement's throat. The wound itself turned the air violent. A spear does not wound quietly. It produces immediate blood, shock, and the instinct to kill back. Phillip's officers and guards reacted as men trained to respond to threats, muskets up, bodies closing around the governor, shouts to hold position or retreat. In those seconds, a contact scene can flip into a massacre, because fear makes people fire at shapes, not at targets. What made Manly Cove distinct, compared with many later frontier moments, is that the armed scramble did not automatically become a slaughter. The British had the capacity to unleash musket fire into a crowd at close range. If they had done so, the story would have ended with multiple deaths on the sand and a war sparked instantly. Instead, the response, while chaotic and armed, remained short, contained, and focused on extracting the wounded governor. That containment was not softness, it was calculation under pressure. Phillip's authority depended on appearing strong, yet strength could not mean blind killing if he wanted the colony to survive the consequences. A governor ordering indiscriminate shooting would satisfy immediate rage, but could unify resistance and make every fishing trip and farm road a battlefield. The decision to avoid escalation shows the logic of early colonial control. Violence used as a tool, restrained when its cost might exceed its gain. Bennelong's role in the immediate aftermath sits at the heart of the event's tension. As a mediator figure, he existed in a dangerous space, close enough to the British to influence their understanding, close enough to Aboriginal men to be present in a moment of confrontation. In documentary terms, his presence highlights that this was not a meeting between strangers with no shared history. It was a meeting already layered with relationship, coercion, obligation, and resentment. The British then had to do something that felt humiliating to an imperial system: withdraw under threat. Removing Philip from the beach was a retreat, even if it was tactical. It demonstrated that the colony's leader could not stand wherever he wished without paying a price in blood. For settlers who believed British authority would expand smoothly, this was a crack in the myth. For Aboriginal defenders, it was proof that even the highest figure could be made to step back. The story's brutality is not only in the spear, but in the balance of power that surrounds it. A spear is a weapon of close distance and personal risk. Muskets, in contrast, are tools of controlled, lethal distance. The British could have turned the beach into a killing ground within seconds. That they did not in that instant does not erase coercion. It shows that coercion was being managed, kept available, pointed, and ready to expand when deemed necessary. Later, retellings often fight over motive. Was the spear an act of revenge, a punishment for trespass, a response to earlier violence, or a boundary enforced at the waterline? The archive rarely gives a single, clean explanation, and that uncertainty is itself part of the frontier. When people are under pressure and trust is broken, motives are read through fear. The British read hostility. Aboriginal men read defence. Both readings could be rooted in real experience. In the next part, we will follow what happened after the sand, how the colony processed the wounding of its governor, how Philip's policies and rules were affected, and how the spearing at Manly Cove became a symbolic story used in later arguments about first contact, either to claim restraint and civility, or to reveal that violence was never far from the surface of early Sydney. After the spear struck on the 7th of September, 1790, the colony had to convert a violent shoreline moment into policy. A wounded governor was not only a medical emergency, it was a test of legitimacy. If Arthur Phillip was seen as unable to move safely beyond Sydney Cove, then the colony's authority looked fragile. If the colony responded with indiscriminate killing, it risked turning fragile into suicidal. The aftermath became a balancing act between vengeance, deterrence, and survival. Philip's first political problem was his own image. In a settlement built on discipline, the governor embodied order. A spear in his body was a public contradiction, so the narrative had to be managed. The event could be framed as a shocking attack, as a dangerous misunderstanding, or as a frontier incident contained by restraint. The choice of framing mattered because it shaped settler behavior. If settlers believed they will always attack, they would shoot first. If settlers believed contact could still be controlled, the colony might buy time. The governor's rules of the game were already under strain before Manly Cove. He wanted to prevent unauthorized violence by convicts and soldiers because it provoked retaliation that Sydney could not afford. But he also presided over expansion, exploration, and resource pressure that made contact increasingly volatile. The spearing forced those contradictions into the open. It proved that mediation could not guarantee safety, and that any attempt to control the frontier with etiquette alone was fantasy. At the same time, Philip could not simply abandon contact. The colony needed knowledge of country, communication, and reduced hostility to keep supply routes and fishing parties alive. Bennelong's importance therefore increased rather than decreased, because after Manly Cove, the alternative to mediation was a hardening spiral of patrols and reprisals. But mediation after blood is different. It is conducted under threat. Every meeting becomes a negotiation with muskets in the background and memory in the foreground. In documentary terms, the brutality of the aftermath is often hidden, because it happens through decisions rather than through a single dramatic clash. The Governor's Council, officers and settlers begin recalibrating what they consider acceptable force. A spear injury becomes a justification for tighter armed readiness, more patrols, harsher punishments, and quicker retaliation when fear rises. Even when the colony claims restraint, the structure of control becomes sharper. The frontier turns into procedure. The incident also deepened a dangerous simplification in settler thinking, treating Aboriginal action as a single unified hostility rather than as diverse communities enforcing boundaries in different ways. Once that simplification takes hold, individual identity matters less than category. That is when violence becomes easier. A frightened settler does not ask which group, which grievance, which law. He hears the story of the Governor's wound and reaches for his musket. Manly Cove becomes a story that travels faster than truth. Phillip's practical response had to address settler panic. Panic is contagious in small colonies. It hardens men, loosens discipline, and produces vigilante behavior that governors cannot control. So the governor's job was to keep private vengeance from becoming public policy. That meant insisting on restraint, while also signaling strength. It meant punishing rogue actions while maintaining patrol capacity. In other words, it meant trying to keep violence monopolized by the state, not released into everyone's hands. The archive often records these dynamics indirectly. Letters, journals, official notes, shifts in language about security, danger, and order. What a documentary can do is make that indirect brutality visible. A single spear wound becomes a lever that moves an entire settlement's posture. It changes how people walk, where they fish, how they travel, what they carry, what they assume. It makes the coastline feel like a trap and country feel like an enemy, even though country is the reason anyone can survive there at all. Bennelong's position becomes even more perilous in this phase. A mediator is often blamed by both sides when violence breaks through. If the British assume he should have prevented the spearing, they may treat him with suspicion. If Aboriginal men assume he has become too close to the governor, they may view him as compromised. The frontier makes mediators walk on broken glass, and one violent moment can turn their usefulness into risk overnight. In the final part, we will bring the story forward into memory, how Manly Cove's spearing was retold, why the name of the spear thrower survives in uncertain spelling, how institutions and popular narratives framed Phillip as restrained or threatened, and how this single wound became a symbol in Australia's larger argument about first contact, whether it was an civil meeting or an early frontier already ready to spill blood. In later decades, the spearing at Manly Cove on the 7th of September, 1790, became more than a shoreline incident. It became a story people used to explain early Sydney, either as proof that the colony tried for peace and met hostility, or as proof that Aboriginal law and refusal remained active from the beginning. The same wound could be turned into two opposite lessons, depending on who told it and what they needed the past to justify. The survival of names in the record shows the archive's unevenness. Arthur Phillip is documented as the colony's decision centre, with motives, orders and movements described in detail. Bennelong appears as a mediator whose presence is essential to British narratives of contact. The spear thrower is often named too, but with unstable spelling, Villimering, Villimarin and other variants, revealing how colonial writing struggled to capture Aboriginal language accurately, even as it tried to assign blame or identify a dramatic actor. That instability matters for documentary truth. It reminds the viewer that the written record is not an objective camera. It is a tool built by the people who arrived with ships, and it preserves what served their priorities. It remembers the governor's authority because authority mattered to empire. It remembers the spear because the spear threatened that authority. It forgets many other people because their identities did not serve the colonial narrative. A documentary must point at that bias rather than quietly inheriting it. Manly Cove also sits in a chain of frontier moments that break the myth of late conflict. The colony's first years were already marked by coercion, raids, hunger-driven violence, and armed standoffs. The governor's spearing was shocking precisely because it struck the colony's center, but it was not born from peace. It came from a landscape where boundaries were disputed, and where the British repeatedly assumed they could step onto shores, take what they needed, and define the rules afterward. The brutality of this story is not only the spear entering flesh. It is the constant pressure that made violence likely at any meeting. People crowded close, misunderstandings amplified by fear, weapons present on both sides, and the memory of earlier harm sitting behind every gesture. In that atmosphere, even restraint becomes a form of control. The colony restrains itself when it calculates the cost, and escalates when it thinks escalation will pay. That is frontier governance. Violence managed like a currency. Phillip's legacy in this episode is complicated and sharp. He tried to prevent the colony from collapsing into uncontrolled killing, not because he rejected coercion, but because he understood that uncontrolled killing could destroy the settlement's chances. His restraint, when it appeared, was strategic restraint. He sought to monopolize force, keep settler vengeance in check, and preserve the possibility of contact through figures like Bennelong. Yet he still presided over expansion, and expansion is a machine that produces confrontation. The spearing becomes a symbol of that contradiction. A governor trying to impose rules in a space where his project breaks the very conditions that rules require. If you take land and food grounds, you cannot expect calm contact indefinitely. The beach meeting at Manly Cove is where the contradiction becomes visible to everyone at once. Authority bleeds, mediation strains, weapons rise. A short-armed scramble shows how near the colony always was to a killing ground. For public history today, Manly Cove forces an uncomfortable clarity. It shows that Aboriginal people were never merely background to exploration. They acted, chose, enforced boundaries, and could strike even the highest figure when they judged it necessary. It also shows that British power, even when it tries to look civil, rests on the ability to injure and to escalate. The frontier is not a misunderstanding, it is a clash of sovereignty, lived out in small spaces with lethal consequences. In documentary terms, the most honest ending does not romanticize either side. It holds the scene in its full weight. A governor walking into contested country, men gathering at a shoreline, a spear thrown with intent, a body wounded, muskets raised, and a decision, in the heat of blood, not to turn the sand into mass death. That last decision matters not as proof of innocence, but as proof that even early on the colony understood it was playing with fire, and that fire could burn it down. The final image is the coastline itself, a place where contact is never simply greeting. It is negotiation under pressure, where the smallest act can become violence, and violence becomes memory that shapes everything after it. Manly Cove is remembered because it shows the frontier at its most concentrated, power exposed, mediation tested, and law contested on the sand. It is an early warning that in New South Wales, the struggle over shorelines and authority began immediately, and it did not end quickly.